Have you ever wondered if you're a narcissist? Most people ask that question the wrong way. They look for a checklist of symptoms, tick boxes, yes or no, and ultimately they feel relieved because they don't fit all the criteria. But Jung said that's exactly the problem. A narcissist will never recognize themselves in a list of symptoms because the narcissistic structure is specifically built to prevent that very recognition. Over the next few minutes, you're going to go through a different kind of test. It's not a questionnaire, not a series of yes or no questions. It's about situations, scenarios, reactions, and how you react to each one will reveal far more about you than any standardized test ever could. So take a deep breath, because the very first situation will show you something important. Situation 1. Someone criticizes you in public. It could be a coworker like Mike. It could be a family member, maybe Aunt Carol, or a friend like Dave. The criticism might even be valid. What happens inside you in the first 3 seconds? If your first reaction is anger, if you immediately think about how to defend yourself, if you start formulating a response before you even process what was said, if you feel an impulse to attack back, to diminish whoever criticized you, to prove them wrong, that's a sign. Jung explained that someone with a narcissistic structure can't separate criticism of their behavior from criticism of their identity. To them, any questioning of what they did is an attack on who they are. And attacks on identity activate primitive defenses that have been there since childhood. Now a healthy person can also feel discomfort with criticism. The difference is what happens after those first 3 seconds. A healthy person can pause. They can consider if the criticism has merit. They can separate the message from the messenger. Someone with a narcissistic structure can't make that pause. The defense is already activated. The counterattack is already underway. Situation 2. You're in a conversation, and someone starts talking about an achievement of theirs, a new job, an award, a personal accomplishment. What happens inside you while they're talking? If you can genuinely rejoice for them, if you can be present in their joy without immediately thinking about your own achievements, if you can listen without feeling the need to mention something of yours that's equal or better, you probably don't have a narcissistic structure. But if, while they're talking, you're already thinking about what you're going to say when it's your turn, if you feel a slight discomfort with their success, if you automatically start to compare, to measure, to evaluate if their achievement diminishes yours in some way, that's a sign. Jung called this narcissistic envy. It's not the common envy of wanting what the other person has. It's a deeper envy. It's the inability to tolerate that someone else has something good without it being a threat to you. It's as if the success of others is a commentary on your failure, even when there's no connection whatsoever. Situation 3. You make a mistake, a clear mistake, a mistake that other people saw. What do you do in the following minutes? If you can admit the mistake, if you can apologize without justifications, if you can take responsibility without immediately shifting part of the blame onto circumstances or other people, you probably have a healthy psychic structure. But if the first thing you do is explain why the mistake happened, if you mention external factors that contributed, if you minimize the seriousness of the error, if you get angry with whoever pointed out the mistake instead of focusing on the mistake itself, that's an important sign. Jung explained that for the narcissistic person, admitting a mistake is admitting a flaw. And admitting a flaw is intolerable because the narcissistic structure is built upon the fantasy of perfection, or at least upon the fantasy of being special. And common mistakes make the person seem common, and seeming common is the worst thing that can happen. Hold on to that, because the next situation is where most people fail. Situation 4. Someone close to you, someone you love, is going through a difficult time. They're sad, frustrated, needing support. What happens inside you? If you can be present, if you can listen without offering immediate solutions, if you can validate what they feel without bringing your own experiences into the conversation, if you can simply be there, holding space for their pain, You have preserved empathic capacity. But if, after a few minutes, you start to get impatient, if you think they're exaggerating, if you feel like telling them how they should solve the problem, if you catch yourself thinking about your own difficulties while they're talking about theirs, if their pain tires you instead of moving you, that's a serious sign. A lack of empathy is one of the central markers of narcissism. But Jung understood something that popular psychology often ignores. The narcissistic person isn't incapable of empathy. They have selective empathy. They can feel empathy for people they admire, for people they want to impress, for people who represent something they desire. But for common people, for close people, for people who don't offer any narcissistic gain, the empathy simply doesn't activate. Situation 5. You're alone, without distraction, without a task, without external stimulus. What happens if you can be comfortable in the silence, if you can be with yourself without anxiety, if you can simply be without needing to do, achieve, or prove anything? You have a stable sense of self. But if the silence bothers you, if you immediately reach for your phone, if you need constant stimulation, constant validation, constant confirmation that you exist and matter, if being alone with your thoughts seems unbearable, that reveals something important about the structure of yourself. Jung explained that the narcissistic person built their sense of identity on top of external reflections. They know themselves through the eyes of others, through achievements, through admiration. When those reflections stop, when they're alone with themselves, there's almost nothing left. The emptiness they spend their entire lives trying to fill finally appears, and it's unbearable. Now comes the most important part of the test, and the part that most people don't want to hear. How did you react to these 5 situations? Not the situations themselves, but the description of them. What did you feel while I was describing the narcissistic signs? If you felt discomfort, if you recognized yourself in some situations and it disturbed you, if you're thinking about how you can work on these issues within yourself, that's a good sign. The capacity for genuine self-analysis and discomfort with one's own patterns is something a rigid narcissistic structure simply won't allow. But if while I was describing those signs, you were thinking about someone else, if you were applying each situation to someone you know, if you were more interested in confirming that someone else is a narcissist than in examining yourself, that might be the biggest sign of all. Carl Jung had a concept called projection. It's the tendency to see in others what we can't recognize in ourselves. That's why the narcissist so frequently accuses others of being narcissists. It's why they easily identify the flaws of others, but are blind to their own. If this entire video served for you to confirm that your ex is a narcissist, that your boss is a narcissist, that your mum is a narcissist, but you yourself emerged unscathed from the analysis, stop, go back, do it again. This time, looking inward. There's a 6th situation that Jung considered the most revealing of all. Situation 6. You're wrong in a discussion, completely wrong. And the other person proves you're wrong, with facts, with logic, with irrefutable evidence. What happens inside you? If you can say, I was wrong, if you can change your mind based on new information, if you can give credit to the other person for showing you something you didn't see, you have psychological flexibility. But if, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, you look for loopholes in the argumentation, if you change the focus of the discussion, if you attack the person instead of the argument, if you simply can't admit you were wrong, even when it's obvious, the narcissistic structure is operating in total protection mode. For the narcissist, being wrong isn't just about being wrong about a topic. It's having the entire edifice of their identity threatened. That's why the defense is so fierce. It's not the argument that's being defended. It's the self itself. Now, let me show you the 3 levels of narcissism that Jung identified. Because not all narcissism is equal, and understanding which level you operate on can make all the difference. The first level Jung called healthy narcissism. Yes, healthy narcissism exists. It's the ability to have self-esteem, to recognize your own worth, to take care of yourself, to have ambitions and want to achieve them. Every person needs a dose of healthy narcissism to function in the world. The second level is defensive narcissism. That's when healthy narcissism is exaggerated to compensate for a wound. The person who brags too much is usually trying to convince themselves as much as others. The person who always needs to be right usually has a terror of being wrong. The person who can't tolerate criticism usually already criticizes themselves too much internally. The third level is pathological narcissism. That's when the narcissistic structure becomes the only way to function. When the person can no longer access other parts of themselves. When the false self has completely taken the place of the true self. This level usually requires professional help because the person can no longer see themselves clearly. Most people watching this video are at the second level, defensive narcissism. Childhood wounds that created exaggerated defenses. Patterns that repeat without the person understanding why. Automatic reactions that seem out of control. And it's this level that can be worked on, that can be healed, that can be transformed. But before talking about healing, let me show you 4 more situations that Jung considered revealing. Situation 7. Someone compliments you. A genuine compliment about something you did well. What happens inside you if you can receive the compliment? If you can say thank you without minimizing what you did? If you can accept recognition without extreme discomfort and without exaggerating the importance, you have a healthy relationship with validation. But here, there are 2 extremes that reveal narcissism. The first extreme is not being able to accept compliments at all, minimizing, deflecting, saying it was nothing. This is the covert narcissist, the person who seems humble but actually has so much need to be special, that they reject any recognition that isn't absolute. The second extreme is absorbing the compliment like oxygen, needing more, waiting for the next one, feeling that one compliment is never enough. This is the classic narcissist, the person who lives off external validation and can never have enough internal reserves. Jung explained that the healthy person can receive compliments because they have an internal sense of worth that doesn't depend on them. They appreciate the recognition, but don't need it to know who they are. The narcissist, on the other hand, needs the compliments to know they exist. Without them, the emptiness appears. Situation 8. You need to ask for help. You're in a situation you can't resolve alone. What happens inside you? If you can ask for help without feeling like you're diminishing yourself, if you can recognize your limitations without it affecting your self-esteem, if you can be vulnerable and admit that you need others and you have a flexible psychic structure. But if asking for help feels like humiliation, if you prefer to suffer alone than admit you can't, if you wait until the last moment, until the situation is critical, because asking for help is intolerable, that reveals a narcissistic structure in operation. For the narcissist, needing help is evidence of failure. It's admitting they aren't self-sufficient. It's showing weakness. It's everything the narcissistic structure was built to avoid. Situation 9. Someone does something better than you, in your area, in your specialty, something you thought was your territory. What happens inside you? If you can genuinely admire them, if you can learn from them, if you can recognize excellence without it diminishing yours, you have a healthy ego that doesn't need to be the best at everything. But if you feel a pang, if you immediately look for flaws in what they did, if you minimize the achievement, if you find ways to explain why it's not really that impressive, narcissistic envy is operating. Jung said that envy is the shadow of admiration. The healthy person can admire. The narcissistic person transforms admiration into envy because admiring the other seems to diminish themselves. Situation 10. You're in a group, and you're not the center of attention. The conversation isn't about you. No one is asking your opinion. What happens inside you? If you can be in the group without needing to stand out, If you can listen to others speak without feeling the need to insert your perspective, if you can exist without being the protagonist, you have a sense of self that doesn't depend on constant attention. But if you start to get restless, if you look for openings to speak, if you feel like you're wasting time when the conversation doesn't include you, if you start to feel invisible and it's unbearable, then that narcissistic need for recognition is definitely present. Now comes something that Jung discovered, and that most people just don't realize. Narcissism has two faces. There's the grandiose narcissism that everyone recognizes. And then there's the vulnerable narcissism that almost no one identifies. Grandiose narcissism is the classic. It's the person who thinks they're superior, who talks about themselves constantly, who needs admiration, who can't tolerate criticism, who dominates conversations, who demands special treatment. But vulnerable narcissism is the apparent opposite. The person seems shy, seems insecure, seems to constantly diminish themselves, seems to suffer from low self-esteem. But underneath, the structure is the same. The vulnerable person also thinks they're special, especially suffering, especially misunderstood, especially sensitive. They also need attention. But the attention they seek is attention for their suffering. They also can't tolerate criticism, but they react with deep hurt instead of anger. Jung explained that the two types are two sides of the same coin, the same childhood wound, the same central emptiness. The difference is only the compensation strategy. One compensates by inflating, the other compensates by deflating. But both are equally distant from the true self. If you recognized yourself more in vulnerable narcissism than in grandiose narcissism, that doesn't mean you're less narcissistic. It just means your defense strategy is different. Hold on, because now I'm going to show you the most disturbing part of this test. Jung identified something he called the narcissistic shadow. It's the part of ourselves that we have the hardest time seeing, and it appears exactly when we're most certain that we're good people. The narcissistic shadow appears when you help someone and expect gratitude, when you do something good and want recognition, when you're generous and tell others about your generosity, when you're humble in a way that others perceive your humility. I'm not saying that every good action is narcissistic. I'm saying that the motivation behind the action reveals the structure. The genuinely generous person helps and moves on. The person with a narcissistic shadow helps and expects a return. Even if it's just admiration, even if it's just thank you, even if it's just the feeling of being a good person. Jung said that the more a person considers themselves evolved, spiritualized, conscious, the more dangerous their narcissistic shadow becomes, because it hides behind the mask of goodness, of humility, of wisdom. If you watch videos about narcissism to confirm that you're the victim, if you consider yourself an evolved person, surrounded by unconscious people, if you believe that you understand others better than they understand themselves, if you feel sorry for normal people who don't have your depth, the narcissistic shadow might be operating without you even realizing it. Now, the crucial question. If you recognized yourself in several of these situations, what do you do? The first step is the most difficult. It's to accept without defending yourself. The immediate tendency is to explain, to justify, to contextualize. This happened because of my childhood. This is only when I'm stressed. This doesn't define who I am. All these explanations might be true, but they can also be defenses that prevent real change. The second step is to observe without judging. For a week, simply observe your reactions. When do you feel the need to defend yourself? When do you feel envy? When do you need to be right? When can't you tolerate criticism? Don't try to change yet. Just observe. Awareness alone already begins to transform things. The third step is to investigate the origin. Jung believed that every narcissistic pattern has a childhood wound underneath, a need that wasn't met, a validation that didn't come, a rejection that left a mark. Finding this origin isn't to victimize yourself. It's to understand what you're trying to compensate for to this day. The fourth step is to develop an internal witness. It's the ability to observe yourself in real time. to notice when the narcissistic defense is being activated, to create a space between the trigger and the reaction. This space is where change happens. The fifth step is to practice vulnerability in small doses. Admit a small mistake. Ask for a little help. Receive criticism without fighting back. Each practice weakens the narcissistic armor and strengthens the true self. Now let me show you something that Jung discovered about the relationship between narcissism and relationships. A person with a narcissistic personality organization has a specific pattern in relationships. In the beginning, they idealize. The partner is perfect, is the love of their life, is different from everyone else. This phase seems magical. It seems they've finally found someone who understands them. But the idealization can't last, because no real human being can maintain the image of perfection. And when the partner reveals that they're human, that they have flaws, that they sometimes fail, the second phase begins, the devaluation. Suddenly, the same partner who was perfect becomes a source of disappointment. The flaws that were once invisible are now amplified. The same person who was the love of their life is now a source of constant frustration. Jung explained that this cycle of idealization and devaluation isn't about the partner. It's about the narcissistic structure. The person idealizes because they need the partner to fill the internal emptiness, and devalues when they realize that no human being can do that. If you recognize this pattern in your relationships, if you always start out infatuated and end up disappointed, if you feel you never find the right person, consider the possibility that the problem isn't in the people you choose. It's in the impossible expectation that you place on them. There's another test that Jung considered revealing. It's observing how you react when someone doesn't respond to you immediately. You send a text, the person sees it, doesn't answer right away. What happens inside you? If you can wait without anxiety, if you assume the person is busy, if you go on with your life without constantly checking your phone, you have a sense of self that doesn't depend on the immediate availability of others. But if you start to interpret, if you imagine the person is ignoring you on purpose, if you get irritated or anxious, if you send another message asking if everything is all right, if you start wondering what you did wrong, the narcissistic need for constant confirmation is present. Jung said that the healthy person tolerates ambiguity, tolerates not knowing, tolerates waiting. The narcissistic person needs constant certainty that they're important, valued, remembered. Any silence is interpreted as rejection. Any wait is unbearable. Now comes the final part of the test, and it's the most important. How are you feeling right now? After going through all these situations, after reading all these descriptions, what's happening inside of you? If you're feeling uncomfortable but curious, if you're recognizing patterns and thinking about how to work through them, if you're feeling the urge to know more about yourself, this productive discomfort is exactly what Carl Jung called the beginning of individuation. But if you're feeling attacked, if you're defending yourself mentally, if you're thinking of all the reasons why this test doesn't apply to you, if you're minimizing what you've read or dismissing it as exaggeration, narcissistic defense is operating in real time. And if you spent the entire video thinking about someone else, applying each situation to someone who hurt you, using this content as a weapon to prove that you're the victim and the other person is the problem, that might be the biggest sign of all. Jung had a quote that sums it all up. Everything that irritates us in others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The person who irritates you the most probably carries something that you don't want to see in yourself. The person you label a narcissist probably reflects some aspect of your own shadow. This doesn't mean that all narcissists are your projections. It means that your intense reaction to them deserves investigation. There's an exercise that Jung recommended for anyone who really wants to know themselves. Think of the 3 people who irritate you the most. It can be anyone: a family member, a co-worker, an ex, a celebrity, anyone who provokes strong irritation. Now list the characteristics of these people that bother you the most. What exactly do they do that irritates you? Can I be specific? Then, and here comes the hard part, ask yourself, where do these same characteristics appear in me? Even if in a different form, even if to a lesser degree, even if I've learned to hide them. Jung said that this exercise is uncomfortable precisely because it works. The shadow that we project onto others is the shadow that we don't want to see in ourselves, and the irritation is proportional to how much we're in denial. If you've done this exercise honestly and haven't found anything, do it again. The narcissistic shadow is an expert at hiding. It will convince you that you're different, that you really don't have these flaws, that your irritation is justified because the others really are like that. But the truth is, we all have a shadow. We all have narcissistic traits. We all have parts of ourselves that we'd prefer not to see. The difference between the person in the process of individuation and the person stuck in the narcissistic structure is the willingness to look. The final question is this: are you willing to look? Not look once and move on. Look continuously. Look every day. Look especially when you're most certain that you're right. Look especially when you want to point the finger at others. Jung spent his entire life analyzing himself, right up to the end. He said that the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And the more you know yourself, the more you realize you have to know. This test wasn't to label you. It wasn't to diagnose you. It was to provoke you, to make you think, to bother you enough so that you want to investigate further. If you've gotten this far and you're still thinking, if you're still wondering, if you're still uncomfortably productive, the test has already fulfilled its purpose. The super thanks isn't just financial support. It's you saying that this kind of content deserves to exist. It's you participating in something that helps people know themselves better. When you click that golden heart, you're investing in consciousness, in your own consciousness, in the consciousness of whoever's going to watch this video tomorrow. There's one last thing that Jung would say if he were here. The goal isn't to eliminate narcissism. It isn't to become a person without an ego. It isn't to destroy the structure that has protected you your entire life. The goal is to make it more flexible, to have a choice, to be able to use the structure when necessary without being controlled by it. The individuated person isn't the person without a shadow. It's the person who knows their shadow, who dialogues with it, who integrates it instead of projecting it onto others. Cured narcissism doesn't disappear. It transforms. The need to be special becomes the ability to recognize what's special in yourself without needing others to confirm it. The sensitivity to criticism becomes the ability to filter what's useful from what's an attack. The difficulty with vulnerability becomes the conscious choice of when it's safe to open up. You don't need to hate yourself for having narcissistic traits. You need to know yourself. And knowing is different from judging. Knowing is different from condemning. Knowing is simply illuminating what was in the dark. Jung said that where there's light, there's shadow. And where there's consciousness, there's a possibility of transformation. If this video made you think, made you question, made you look inward even for a moment, it has fulfilled its purpose. The real work begins now, begins after the video ends, begins in your day-to-day reactions, in your relationships, in your choices. In the comments, tell me which situation bothered you the most. You don't need to explain why. You can simply write the number. Situation 1. Situation 5. Situation 9. Let's see which ones are the most common. I'll reply to everyone in the first 2 hours.